Welcome to Wandering Jews, a J-Square Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself.
We're your hosts. I'm Scott.
And I'm Sorrel. The Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, has always been more than just a body of water. It actually represents a cornerstone of the Zionist dream, a hub for agricultural settlements that allowed Israel to become self-sufficient and sustainable. The Kinneret and the surrounding Galilee were pivotal in fostering community building and innovation. This region has such a rich history, from Jesus and his followers to the Jewish mysticism of Safat, and later the Zionist pioneers. Today, Wandering Jews, we're going to be exploring the Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, focusing on the pioneering figures who not only developed this crucial region, but paved the way for the future of Israel. It's a story of dreams, determination, but also the harsh realities they faced.
Yeah, so much of that story is things that I think hard for us to imagine just because Israel is in such a different place today. We go out for coffee at a very nice coffee shop. That coffee shop is located next to a fully stocked mall with all the international brands. In general, we're a very modern, Western, consumer-style society. But think about these folks, and I love this piece by the author Asaf Inbari, and he says, wait a second. Before we get into like all the ideology and the philosophy and the vision, let's talk about something much more basic. At Kinneret, on the Galilee shore, at the turn of the century, it was hot as hell. And these people had no air conditioning. And in fact, when air conditioning first came to Israel, and we're talking about in the essentially late 1950s, early 60s, the Tadiran company placed, if I'm not mistaken, the first air conditioner in the hut of David Ben-Gurion.
Really?
Israel's, of course, first prime minister, was already retired at that point, at Kibbutz Sde Boker. And Ben-Gurion's response when they were about to put in the air conditioner was, you know what? We really don't need it. We should get used to the heat. We should become children of the land. Eventually, he agreed. Maybe Paula, his wife, argued with him and convinced him, which is a good thing to do.
Thank God for Paula.
But he even waited until he had finished serving as prime minister and had left the parliament in 1963 to have the air conditioning installed. I mean,
wow.
Just amazing. But it says a lot about the mindset. Again, these young pioneers were coming to a place which was very much a desert, very much a wilderness. It's not that there wasn't anyone living here. It's not that it was a total jungle.
Century, right? We're talking about the early 20th century.
It was a very backward, underdeveloped corner of, at that time, the decrepit Ottoman Empire. And the country over the years obviously had to do everything with our own hands in order to move from that situation to the country that we live in today. And so in that sense, there's also this issue of kind of appreciating development over time and also appreciating I would even say, the heroism of these early builders, because they were really giving up everything, leaving their parents in Eastern Europe for the most part, coming to a place where it was totally unknown. Like Nathan Alterman, the poet, says, they were beggars with dreams. You know, and you can almost picture this image of them carrying these small backpacks with very little personal belongings, stuffed with the dreams and the visions that they hoped would build a new home for the Jewish people in the land of Israel.
It's crazy how much we take for granted. You know, you're talking about David Ben-Gurion and how he didn't think air conditioning was necessary. If our air conditioning is turned off for even 30 minutes, it's, you know, what's going on? What are we going to do? Let's call someone out. We have
Let
an
alone
emergency.
If the internet fails.
Exactly. Oh, that would just be a double disaster. That could not happen in our home. And we take so much for granted. And then we know Israel's a young country, so we think we're still kind of in our infancy. And when we think back to the dreamers and the visionaries, you mentioned, you know, Ben-Gurion, there's a kind of like romantic association. And what we don't take into account and what you're making me think, Scott, is how this idealism was coupled with a really grueling reality. So much physical challenges, so much emotional strain that we don't have to experience today. And, I guess that's also part of where the toughness of the Israeli psyche, the Israeli mentality comes in. We had to be tough, right? I mean, it's a testimony to the birth of the new Jew, returning to Israel to physical, grueling work, which, again, is not something that we associate necessarily physical work in 2024. We don't think of it. But back then, in order to develop the land, that was what it meant to be the new Jew for the greater good of this vision. And, we think about also like the words chalutz. And, I think it was Chaim Weitzman who said to be a Zionist, it's not necessary to be mad, but it helps, right? Who are the people, Scott, who at that time that you can really think of that inspired that vision, that symbol of national rebirth?
Yeah, when you talk about that image of the chalutz, the pioneer, which again also is an important piece of the American story in a very, very different way. When we think about our story here in Israel, you can mention a few different people. I mean, one person, for example, Joseph Trumpeldor. Trumpeldor had been a military officer in the Tsarist army.
Wow.
Lost one of his arms in the Russo-Japanese War. Someone who was tough as nails. He was a vegetarian. He slept on the floor even when there was a bed available because, again, he believed that this was the way that you built yourself up.
Ben-Gurion's kind of guy.
Ben-Gurion's kind of guy. And it's not by accident that when Trumpeldor fell at Tel Chai, north of Kinneret, he is remembered by saying the famous words, "It's good to die for one's country." Now, whether he said that or whether he swore in Russian is a bit of a debate. But again, this image of this tough as nails sleeping on the floor, one armed hero going out to settle the land, that's one amazing example. A.D. Gordon. A.D. Gordon, when he came to live in the land of Israel and arrived in Kinneret, he was already in his early 40s. He became a kind of a father figure or a bit of guru to many of these young pioneers. And one of the stories that I remember being told by Muki Tzor, one of the really outstanding, amazing teachers of the kibbutz movement and of Israel in general. And Muki Tzor, I remember him telling the story how they all went out to work and they were meant to be digging holes to plant trees. And the young pioneers, people were working. They were literally back-breaking. Even in the winter, it was hot. It was full of mosquitoes. And when they took a break, there's A.D. Gordon taking his time, digging the perfect hole. And the young pioneers, they were a little bit pissed off. Gordon, what is the story? We're working here. You're supposed to be digging holes. And Gordon said to them, a hole. But look at this hole. What a hole. And Gordon had this mystical, almost religious connection with work and nature and the land of Israel. And he really believed that by returning to the land, by investing ourselves wholeheartedly in community building, reclaiming the land, being able to grow our own food, we would be born anew. I'll name one more person. We could go on and on. The poetess who is known simply as Rachel, right? Exactly, Rachel Bluestein. Tragic story of a woman who her life was full of wandering from her home in Eastern Europe to the land of Israel, to Paris to study agriculture. At a certain time, she contracted tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, malaria, even suicide, unfortunately, was very, very common among the young pioneers. And she died at the age of 40. But she left behind a body of poetry which even today Israelis look at, and she's like the mother of Hebrew poetry. And it's a combination of this longing for a meaningful life and a connection with the land and the desire to work and be part of a community that I think made her so famous. And so when you visit, for example, the Kinneret farm and the cemetery on the shore of the Galilee, and you're looking towards the Golan Heights, and you see her grave among many, many others there. It's really still today a place of national pilgrimage.
How old was she when she came to Israel, Rachel?
Well, we're talking about in general people who were in their teens and in their 20s. They were kids who grew up in youth movements. They were kids who were young
like
students.
Ben-Gurion,
yes,
he was also.
For sure.
He founded a youth movement.
For sure. And so, again, we're talking about people who maybe because they were young, maybe because they were growing up in a society where the Jewish people were a very oppressed, impoverished minority, and many, many Jews at that time, 1880s, 1890s, beginning of the 20th century, leaving to go to the United States. Over 1 million Jews leaving the Tsarist Empire to go to New York and Boston, and then further afield, Cleveland and Cincinnati and Denver and San Francisco and etc. But there were those small groups who said, we're coming home. And for them, home was coming home to the land of Israel. The second and the third Aliyah, the period right before the first and right after the First World War.
And when I think about young people today, right, as, you know, in Israel, let's say IDF soldiers, I think there's something about the fact that the visionaries, the dreamers, the people who are serving, who are being active in the continuity and protection of the country, whether it's in 1910 or in 2024, there's something about that youth that fosters this feeling of invincibility, right? That helps you to be in that dreamer, visionary mindset, because that's a time to be daring, to take risks when you don't, you know, as you progress, as you get older, you realize more and more what's at stake. And the young people who are just able to overcome that, and they're able to just see the dream. And that's what, you know, got us to where we are today.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And I think that that's true also today in Israel in a lot of ways. Not only young people who are serving in the military, but people who are artists, people who are studying medicine, people who, whatever area that they're studying or working in, there's still a lot of vision in Israel, a lot of motivation among young people. Again, that's changed a lot in Israel, and there are other things as well. But I still think that if you compare that sense of, I also am part of a community and have to contribute to that community, that's something which still today typifies Israel, or characterizes Israel in a way which is still quite different, quite pronounced, as compared to most other Western countries. And in that sense, when one visits the Kinneret Cemetery, it's partially, again, as I say, the site, just the beauty of the shoreline and the beauty of the scenery all around. You're walking in a sacred place, not just because it's a cemetery. It's the pantheon of the Zionist dream. You know, Rachel, and we mentioned A.D. Gordon, Burl Katz-Nelson, who was an outstanding political figure, educator, activist in the pre-state period. Naomi Shemer, another woman who, as a national poetess, Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Lu Yehi, Let It Be. Her songs also, when those songs come on the radio, most Israelis kind of sit back a little bit because there's something about them which captures a certain essence of hope, of vision, which we all want to be still, I think, at the core of who we are as a nation. And so when we're visiting the Kinneret Cemetery, you know, I think there is a kind of a personal connection that can be made. And the job, I think, of a Torah educator or an Israel expert when they're with a group is to share some of these stories, is to share some of that passion, is to put it in a certain kind of context. You know, one of the things that I always do when I'm at Kinneret at the cemetery, you know, is I always play, you know, a song by The Clash or by The Who, you know. People try to put us down, my generation, because there's something in that youth revolt, that youth culture, which you talked about, that, yeah, it captures something great about being a teenager, being in your 20s, maybe even being in your 30s today. For someone who's in their 50s or 60s, like myself, it's a bit different. You have a bit of a different perspective on what life is, but because I was very much brought up on the stories of these people in the youth movement I grew up in, so I feel a great responsibility to tell the stories of the people who were buried in Kinneret and to share the power of that vision, the price that was paid, because there definitely was a price, but also the question of, hey, in our lives, regardless of how old you are, what are the things that you find most meaningful, that you're really willing to commit to, that you're really willing to put your all for in order to make it come true? Even if make it come true, all right, success is going to be small, but a small success is better than no success.
And when you were talking about youth movements as being the catalyst for this feeling of togetherness, of growth, of vision, of leadership, of pioneering, when I think back to what we were discussing about the people who came to Israel and they settled the land and the sacrifices that they made, it's that feeling of togetherness, of community, which is so psychologically healthy, that also is like an amazing recipe for resilience, because regardless of the physical hardships, which were real, and it was a real physical price, but I think that we can all connect to the idea today that community is what can keep you sane. A shared vision is what can keep you surviving from day to day, and not only surviving, but thriving.
Yeah, definitely. One of the big debates that have gone on in Western democracies over the last couple of decades is the question of what happens when a sense of shared community begins to disintegrate. One of the books that kind of pushed this debate was a book called Bowling Alone, Putnam. And, in Israel, comparatively, again, Israel has changed radically. We're not the same, socialist-driven, kibbutz-based country that we were many, many years ago. Again, we're a very modern, in some ways, very individual society. But still, when you take a look at Israel, and maybe it has to do with both our history and the role models that we have, some of them who we mentioned here. Maybe it has to do with, you mentioned, the reality of conflict all throughout the years of the state. There is a sense, and maybe it's just a general sense of kind of call it Jewish peoplehood, for lack of a better term. The idea that somehow we're not alone in this, that I'm an I, but I'm also part of a we. And when we visit places like the Kinneret Farm and the Kinneret Cemetery, and we look back on these parts of our history, I think also part of it is giving us that sense of, hey, it's important not to lose that. It's important that especially us as a small people, as a small country, have that sense of togetherness, of community, of solidarity. That's an important resource, not just for the present, also for moving ahead towards the future.
And you don't normally think of a cemetery as a place to keep a dream alive. But essentially, that's what you're saying, because the people who are buried there, they are helping us even today with their vision of keeping the dream and the country very much alive.
100%. I mean, again, that's one of the reasons, not just places like Kinneret Farm and the Kinneret Cemetery, but almost any historical site, so-called, that I visit around the country, the sense that the people who came before us, we're here and we have the privilege of standing on their shoulders, that they still can be, even if they're no longer alive, incredible inspirations who we can learn from and strengthen us today and tomorrow. I think that's an important reason to come to these sites, to take in these sites, to hear the stories, and to ask ourselves, hey, if these people could do it, in this case, in the middle of nowhere, so to speak,
with no air conditioning.
Exactly. Wow. We have so many advantages.
True.
What can we do? And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own.
We are again with one of our tour educators, our tour experts. Today with Muki Yankelovich. Really happy to have Muki on board. Outstanding educator, veteran guide, and just all around beautiful person. Muki, glad again that you're with us. If you can share just a couple of lines about who you are, where you live, a little bit about your background.
Sure, Scott. So my name is Muki, and as soon as you hear me talk, you can probably tell that I am originally from South Africa. I grew up in just outside of Johannesburg in a place called Krugersdorp. I was very involved in the Zionist youth group Habonim Dror, and made Aliyah in 1987, lived for a period on a kibbutz, lived in Jerusalem, and for the last 25 years have been living in the city of Modi'in. I'm married, I have 2 sons, I'm actively involved in a chavurah, Jewish community here, and my career has basically been to be a Jewish educator in a classroom, in the field, in Israel, in the diaspora, and my studies have by and large been in a similar field, be it my studying to be a tour guide or my master's in Midrash and Agadah from the Shechter Institute.
We talked about in the core part of the episode about Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, the period of the pioneers at the beginning of the 20th century. And I'm going to hand it over to you as an educator and a youth movement graduate. Is it relevant today? And where would you take that question? How would you begin to answer it in light of where Israeli society is at?
I would definitely think that the Mechina program is something that is in parallel with the pioneers idea. The Mechina is actually, it's an abbreviation for Mechina Kedam Tzva'it, which means Army Preparatory Course. And I think it's the latest iteration of the spirit of the early pioneers. The pioneers themselves came and established groups to do things. These programs were established from above, were established by organizations, but the ethos of groups of young people spending an intense time living together, studying together, volunteering together, and building a society together is something that's very much a parallel, a modern equivalent, and creating out of it a modern pioneering.
And we're talking about essentially what one could call an Israeli gap year.
Absolutely. The idea began in 1988 when the Orthodox sector were troubled by the fact that their young men were going to the army, and with their encounter with secular Israel, too many of them, from their perspective, were losing their religion. And they wanted to create a program to prepare them for the military, both prepare them for the service itself, but also to prepare them spiritually, intellectually, as religious Jews. And so in 1988, they created a program called B'nai David. They had to get permission from the army to allow these guys to defer their service for a year. And they spent the year studying texts, volunteering, living as a group, strengthening their personal religious identity. And it was deemed a marvelous success, both in terms of the religious identity that they sought to maintain, but also turns out that this extra year of introspection, this extra year of maturity led to these young men volunteering for combat units in a much higher percentage, becoming officers at a much higher rate than a typical cohort. And the idea took off. And within a couple of years, there were a number of parallel programs, all within the Orthodox sector. After the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, there was a sense in the secular world that they too needed to prepare young people for the challenges of the world, for the challenges of Israeli society, and Israeli society that was coming apart at the seams, where there were people claiming ownership of Judaism and other people not thinking about whether they had any ownership to Judaism or not. And so they begin in 1997 to create secular Mechina programs. The idea of these programs was to bring a whole lot of young people together for a year. They were co-ed programs from the beginning, and spend a year studying traditional texts and volunteering and doing physical and intellectual preparation for the army. And these programs also took off to the extent that today there are, I believe, 54 such programs, gap year programs, some of them 6 months, most of them a year, and they have diversified. So there are still the programs for Orthodox boys or Orthodox girls. There are these secular programs, but there's also programs for mixed religious and secular, programs for Israel and diaspora, in which English-speaking students or students that can speak a certain basic Hebrew can come and participate. There's a Mechinah program for the young Druze population. There's a mixed Arab and Jewish Mechinot. There is a Mechinah program for ultra-Orthodox Jews that have left ultra-Orthodoxy and need to adjust to regular life. Of course, the different denominations have also got their Mechinah programs. So the Reform movement today has a program which I think may be of a special interest to some of our listeners today. It's called Mechinat Telem. They have 2 branches, and definitely worth Googling for those that are a little more interested. Telem, T-E-L-E-M, is a program run by the Reform movement in Jaffa and in Holon in the spirit of the Reform movement. Now, what has happened in the decades since these programs were established is that there are now hundreds of graduates of these programs, people that have spent a very intense year with other people. And I think back to my own gap year, which was spent as someone who came from South Africa to Israel. It was crucial in my Jewish identity. It was crucial in the end, in my aliyah, in my decision to come here. The friendships from that year are still significant friendships for me. And so many of those same aspects play out on the Mechinah program, with the added piece, I think, that like the pioneers at Kinneret, these groups of people come out with a vision for the kind of Israel that they want to build, and with an articulated sense of leadership, an articulated sense of belonging. So my suggestion is, if there is an opportunity while you're here for your group or your program to visit with one of these Mechinah programs, be it the Mechinah Telem, the Reform Movement program, or any of the others, and to meet high caliber young Israelis that, despite the difficult time that we are going through right now, are thinking about what kind of Israel we want to build, what kind of Israel we would like to have. And that would certainly be my tip.
Beautiful.
For our listeners today.
Really appreciate it. As we in Hebrew we say, as you know, milim kidur banot, words that are as sharp as a porcupine's quills. And especially your final remarks about the search for community, values, vision, direction, friendship, all these things which, whether people were alive in the 1910s or 1920s during the period of the classical pioneers, or whether they're around today with us, we certainly hope that these values will continue to be central to Israeli life and to our young people, that they can take us forward to better times. Mookie, thanks so much for joining us for Something for the Road.
My pleasure. Hope to see you and others on the road.
For sure. And hopefully, as people are coming to Israel and traveling on our Jewish heritage destinations in Europe, people will have a chance to meet Mookie and to travel with him and learn with him, and with our other super team of tour educators and travel experts.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's j2adventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures. And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Sorel.
I'm Scott.
See you soon with the Wandering Jews.